picture of 17th century Japan when a samurai approaches, you bow deeply, as is expected this. You're walking through the streets, but perhaps not quickly enough. Or maybe your bow wasn't quite deep enough for his liking. In an instant, his katana flashes from its sheath, and you're dead before you hit the ground. This wasn't murder. This was justice. This was the brutal reality of Kirisute Gomen, the legal right of any samurai to cut down anyone beneath their social class who they felt had disrespected them. And here's the truly horrifying part. This wasn't some rare occurrence whispered about in dark corners. This was everyday life under the samurai code. Before we dive deeper into this blood-soaked world, take a moment to like this video if you're ready to have everything you thought you knew about samurai honor completely shattered, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing our global community come together to explore history's darkest truths. Now, when most people think of samurai, they picture noble warriors bound by an unbreakable code of honor, loyal servants who would rather die than betray their masters, men who lived and breathed Bushido, the way of the warrior, with its emphasis on loyalty, courage, and righteousness. We imagine them as the Japanese equivalent of Arthurian knights, paragons of virtue in a world of chaos. But here's what nobody tells you. This entire image is a lie, a carefully constructed myth that has more in common with Disney fairy tales than historical reality. The truth about samurai is so brutal, so shocking, that it will fundamentally change how you view not just Japanese history, but the very nature of honor itself. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just the story of a warrior class gone wrong. It's the story of how an entire culture constructed one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns to hide centuries of brutality, betrayal, and bloodshed. You see, the samurai weren't noble warriors following an ancient code. They were parasitic warlords who drained Japan's resources while contributing almost nothing to society. They weren't loyal to their masters. Medieval Japan was defined by constant betrayal, with crucial battles routinely decided not by courage or skill, but by which side could bribe the most enemy samurai to switch sides. And that famous Bushido code? It didn't even exist during the height of samurai power. It was invented centuries later by a Christian convert trying to make Japanese culture more palatable to Western audiences. But the lies go deeper than just romanticized history. The samurai code wasn't just absent. It was actively contradicted by the daily reality of samurai life. These weren't men who valued honor above life. They were men who turned human suffering into entertainment, who tested their swords on living prisoners, and who created a society so violent that parents lived in constant fear their children might be murdered for the crime of insufficient bowing. Let me tell you about tameshigiri. This was the practice of testing sword sharpness. And if you think they used bamboo or straw dummies, you're tragically mistaken. They used human bodies, fresh corpses when they could get them, but living criminals when they couldn't. Picture crowds gathering to watch samurai slice through stacked human torsos, counting how many bodies a single sword could cut through in one stroke. This wasn't warfare. This wasn't justice. This was entertainment. And it became so popular that Japan faced a shortage of dead bodies, leading to people literally hunting for unidentified corpses along riverbanks to meet demand. The samurai didn't just participate in this horror, they institutionalized it. They created an entire economy around human suffering, where the quality of a sword was measured not by its craftsmanship, but by how cleanly it could sever human spines. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the samurai code, the practice of seppuku, or ritual suicide. Now, you might think you know about seppuku, the honorable warrior who chooses death over dishonor, making a quick, clean end to preserve his dignity. But the reality of seppuku was nothing like this sanitized version. It was a prolonged torture session disguised as honor. The proper method, developed over centuries of refinement, wasn't a single cut. The samurai would plunge a short sword into the left side of his abdomen, draw it laterally across to the right, then turn it upward. But that was just the beginning. Exemplary form required stabbing again below the sternum, pressing downward across the first cut, and then piercing the throat. And here's the part that will haunt your dreams. This process didn't kill quickly. Samurai regularly survived for hours after completely disemboweling themselves. Takayama Hikokuro survived 19 hours after severing his intestines. Admiral Onishi Takijiro lasted 15 hours after cutting his stomach and stabbing his throat. Imagine the agony. Imagine sitting in a formal ceremony surrounded by witnesses as your life slowly leaks out through wounds you've inflicted on yourself. This wasn't honor. This was systematic torture elevated to the level of religious ritual. But even this pales in comparison to what the samurai did to others, because while seppuku was reserved for samurai themselves, the violence they inflicted on the rest of society was limitless. Under the feudal system, samurai weren't just permitted to kill commoners who disrespected them, they were expected to. It was seen as maintaining proper social order. A samurai who allowed disrespect to go unpunished was himself dishonored. The stories from this period read like horror fiction. Samurai wrapping peasants in straw capes and setting them on fire. Mass executions for crimes as minor as failing to remove one's hat quickly enough. Children murdered for looking directly at a samurai instead of keeping their eyes downcast, and all of this was legal. All of this was considered proper behavior for a warrior following the code of honor. This is where the true brutality of the samurai system becomes clear. It wasn't just that individual samurai were violent, it was that violence was the foundation of their entire social structure. The samurai didn't rule through law or consent. They ruled through terror. Every interaction between a samurai and a commoner was a potential death sentence, and everyone knew it. The psychological impact of this system cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a world where half the population has the legal right to kill you for any perceived slight, where your children must learn from infancy to prostrate themselves before certain classes of people, knowing that a single mistake could mean death, where the very people supposed to protect society are its greatest threat. This is the world the samurai created, not through accident or corruption, but by design. Because the samurai understood something that modern people often forget. Fear is the most effective form of control. A population living in constant terror doesn't rebel. It doesn't question authority. It simply obeys, hoping that submission will be enough to survive another day. And the most insidious part, the samurai convinced themselves and others that this system was honorable. They created elaborate rituals and philosophies to justify their brutality. They spoke of duty and loyalty while betraying their masters for better offers. They claimed to value life while treating human beings as disposable test subjects. They positioned themselves as protectors while being the primary source of violence in their society. This cognitive dissonance wasn't accidental. It was necessary because even the most hardened warrior needs to believe that what they're doing serves some greater purpose. The samurai couldn't simply admit they were parasitic warlords bleeding society dry. They needed to believe they were noble protectors following an ancient code. So they created that code retroactively and convinced themselves it had always existed. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of samurai culture wasn't what they did to their enemies. It was what they did to their own children. Because the brutality of the samurai code didn't begin when a man picked up a sword. It began in childhood with a systematic process of psychological conditioning designed to strip away human empathy and replace it with mechanical obedience to violence. Young boys destined for samurai status weren't just taught to fight. They were taught to kill without hesitation, to view human life as expendable, and to find honor in brutality. Their training included not just swordsmanship and archery, but desensitization to human suffering. They were forced to witness executions, to participate in the torture of prisoners, and to prove their worthiness through acts of cruelty. This wasn't education. This was systematic child abuse designed to create monsters. And it worked. Generation after generation of samurai emerged from this system convinced that their capacity for violence made them superior to the rest of humanity. They genuinely believed that their willingness to kill and be killed elevated them above ordinary moral considerations. The training methods reveal just how calculated this brutalization was. Children were taught to suppress all emotional responses to violence. They learned to view mercy as weakness and compassion as dishonor. By the time they reached adulthood, they had been so thoroughly conditioned that acts of extreme violence felt not just normal, but righteous. This is why the samurai system persisted for so long. It wasn't just a political structure or military organization. It was a comprehensive psychological framework that turned human beings into weapons and convinced them this transformation was noble. Each generation passed this trauma to the next, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of brutality that lasted for centuries. And the children who survived this system, they became some of history's most efficient killers, not because they were naturally violent, but because they had been systematically stripped of their humanity and rebuilt as instruments of death. They emerged from their training believing that their capacity for brutality was a gift from the gods, a mark of their divine right to rule over lesser beings. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because the samurai didn't just create monsters. They created a culture that celebrated monstrosity as the highest form of human achievement. They turned cruelty into ceremony, murder into art, and suffering into spectacle. And they did it all while claiming to follow a code of honor that, as we've established, didn't even exist during their reign of terror. Consider the 47 Ronin, perhaps the most famous example of samurai loyalty in all of Japanese history. The story goes that after their master was forced to commit seppuku for attacking a court official, these masterless samurai spent a year planning their revenge. They infiltrated the official's compound, killed him, and then accepted execution as the price for their loyalty. It's been held up for centuries as the ultimate example of Bushido in action. Except, here's what really happened. Their master, Asano Naganori, attacked Kira Yoshinaka in the shogun's palace. Within hours, before any investigation, before any testimony, before any attempt to understand what had occurred, Asano was ordered to disembowel himself. The speed of this condemnation reveals something chilling about samurai justice. Palace records show that Asano attacked Kira before midday, was placed in custody at 1 in the afternoon, received his death sentence at 4, and was dead by 6. 6 hours from crime to execution, with no trial, no defense, no investigation. This wasn't justice. This was elimination of inconvenience. Someone in power wanted Asano dead, and the samurai code provided the perfect excuse. The man never had a chance to explain his actions, to present evidence, or even to speak in his own defense. He was simply ordered to die, and he obeyed, because that's what samurai did. They died when told to die. No questions asked. The 47 Ronin didn't seek justice for their master. They sought revenge for a political assassination carried out under the guise of honor. And when they completed their mission, they too were ordered to die, because their actions threatened the stability of a system built on unquestioning obedience. The authorities couldn't allow the precedent that samurai might investigate the circumstances of their master's death or question the decisions of their superiors. So the Ronin died, and their deaths were transformed into legend. Their story became proof of samurai loyalty, evidence that the warrior code created men willing to sacrifice everything for honor. But the reality was far more sinister. The 47 Ronin were executed because they had dared to think for themselves, to question authority, to seek truth in a system built on lies. Their deaths weren't honorable. They were necessary to preserve a corrupt order. This pattern repeats throughout samurai history. Every story of honor, when examined closely, reveals itself to be a story of control. Every tale of loyalty masks a reality of coercion. Every legend of noble sacrifice hides a truth of systematic brutality. Take the practice of junshi, the ritual suicide of retainers following their master's death. This wasn't voluntary devotion. It was expected, demanded, enforced through social pressure and legal obligation. When a daimyo died, his closest followers were expected to follow him into death, not because they chose to, but because failure to do so would bring disgrace upon their families and descendants. Imagine the psychological torture of this system. You serve a lord knowing that his death will require your own. You form relationships, build a life, have children, all while living under the constant shadow of mandatory suicide. When the moment comes, you can't refuse without destroying everything you build, without condemning your children to lives of shame and poverty. This wasn't honor. This was psychological terrorism elevated to the level of religious duty. The samurai created a system where human beings were treated as disposable accessories to their masters' lives, valuable only insofar as they were willing to die on command. And the most horrifying part, they convinced their victims that this was noble. They created elaborate ceremonies around these forced suicides, complete with poetry and ritual preparation. They transformed murder into art, coercion into choice, slavery into honor. They made their victims complicit in their own destruction by convincing them that death was privilege rather than punishment. This is the true genius of the samurai system. It didn't just control people's bodies. It controlled their minds. It convinced them that their suffering was sacred, their oppression was honor, their deaths were gifts. It created a population so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would thank their oppressors even as those oppressors destroyed them. But the system's control mechanisms went far beyond psychological manipulation. The samurai also perfected the art of collective punishment, ensuring that any individual's resistance would result in consequences for their entire community. If one person stepped out of line, their family, their neighbors, their entire village might pay the price. This created a society of informants, where everyone watched everyone else, where trust became impossible, where survival depended on absolute conformity to samurai demands. Parents taught their children to fear and obey, not because they believed it was right, but because they knew the consequences of resistance would fall not just on the disobedient child, but on the entire family line. The samurai understood that humans are social creatures, that our deepest fears center not on our own suffering, but on the suffering we might cause others. They weaponized this instinct, making every act of defiance a potential death sentence for innocent people. In doing so, they created a population that policed itself, that crushed its own impulses toward freedom rather than risk harm to loved ones. And through it all, the samurai maintained their facade of honor. They spoke of protecting society while terrorizing it. They claimed to serve justice while perverting it beyond recognition. They positioned themselves as guardians of order while being the primary source of chaos and violence in their world. This contradiction wasn't hypocrisy in the traditional sense. It was something far more dangerous. It was the complete separation of ideology from reality, the ability to believe sincerely in principles while acting in direct opposition to them. The samurai genuinely believed they were honorable while committing acts of unspeakable brutality. They saw themselves as noble while behaving as monsters. This psychological split allowed them to commit atrocities without losing their self-image as righteous warriors. They could torture prisoners while maintaining their belief in Bushido. They could murder children while considering themselves protectors. They could betray their masters while claiming perfect loyalty. The most chilling aspect of this system wasn't its cruelty, though that was extreme. It wasn't its hypocrisy, though that was profound. It was its sustainability. The samurai managed to maintain this contradictory worldview for centuries, passing it down from generation to generation, creating an entire culture built on the foundation of systematic self-deception. This self-deception wasn't just a convenient fiction, it was a survival mechanism that allowed the samurai class to function without confronting the horror of what they had become. But the cost of this psychological armor was the complete erosion of genuine human connection. Samurai couldn't form real relationships because every interaction was filtered through layers of ritual, hierarchy, and the constant threat of violence. Consider what it meant to be a samurai's wife. You married not a man, but an institution. Your husband might be ordered to die at any moment, and you were expected to celebrate his death as honorable. Your children might be taken from you for training in brutality, and you were supposed to be grateful for the honor. Your own life was forfeit if your husband's loyalty was ever questioned. You lived in a gilded cage surrounded by luxury, but stripped of agency, autonomy, or genuine human connection. The women of samurai families weren't just victims of this system, they were its enablers and enforcers. Mothers taught their daughters to accept subjugation as virtue. They raised their sons to view empathy as weakness. They participated in ceremonies that glorified the very system that oppressed them. They had to, because resistance meant death not just for themselves, but for everyone they loved. This creates one of the most disturbing aspects of samurai culture. The victims became the perpetuators. Each generation passed on the trauma, the conditioning, the systematic dehumanization that had been inflicted upon them. Children who had been brutalized grew up to brutalize others, convinced that this cycle of violence was not just normal, but sacred. The psychological mechanisms that made this possible are terrifyingly familiar to anyone who has studied modern cult behavior. Isolation from outside perspectives, punishment for questioning authority, rewards for conformity, and above all, the constant reinforcement that suffering was not just inevitable, but meaningful. The samurai created a society-wide Stockholm syndrome, where the oppressed identified so completely with their oppressors that they couldn't imagine any other way of living. But perhaps the most revealing insight into samurai psychology comes from examining what happened when their power began to crumble. As Japan opened to the West in the mid-19th century, the samurai found themselves increasingly irrelevant. Modern weapons made their martial skills obsolete. International trade made their feudal economics unsustainable. Democratic ideas made their authoritarian rule untenable. Their response was not adaptation or reform. It was desperate, violent resistance to any change that might threaten their position. The samurai who had claimed to serve Japan above all else suddenly revealed that their true loyalty was to their own power. They launched rebellions against modernization, fought wars to preserve their privileges, and ultimately chose destruction over transformation. This final phase of samurai history strips away any remaining pretense about honor or service. When faced with the choice between Japan's progress and their own dominance, the samurai chose dominance. When offered the opportunity to contribute to a more just society, they chose to preserve an unjust one that favored them. Their actions in the face of inevitable change revealed the hollowness of everything they claimed to believe. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 perfectly encapsulates this moral bankruptcy. Saigo Takamori, often called the last true samurai, led thousands of warriors in a doomed campaign against the imperial government. They weren't fighting for principle or justice. They were fighting to maintain their right to carry swords, to extract tribute from peasants, to rule through violence rather than law. These men who had spent centuries claiming to embody discipline and restraint threw tantrum after tantrum when told they could no longer terrorize the population. They who had preached loyalty to authority rebelled when that authority no longer served their interests. They who had elevated death before dishonor above all other values chose to live as outlaws rather than accept a world where they couldn't dominate others. The rebellion's end was fitting. Saigo and his followers, surrounded and facing certain defeat, chose to commit seppuku rather than surrender. But this wasn't the noble death their mythology promised. It was the final act of men who had built their entire identity around violence and couldn't imagine existence without it. They died not as heroes, but as relics of a brutal past that Japan was finally ready to leave behind. Yet, even in defeat, the samurai managed one final manipulation. They transformed their rebellion from a selfish attempt to preserve privilege into a romantic last stand for traditional values. They reframed their violence as loyalty, their stubbornness as principle, their failure as tragedy. The very people who had spent centuries oppressing Japan became symbols of Japanese virtue. This transformation reveals the most insidious aspect of samurai culture, its ability to rewrite its own history. The same class that had terrorized Japan for centuries managed to convince subsequent generations that they had been its protectors. The warriors who had drained society's resources became symbols of service. The men who had made betrayal an art form became paragons of loyalty. How did this happen? How did a parasitic warrior class manage to transform itself from historical villain to cultural hero? The answer lies in the Meiji period's desperate need for national identity. As Japan raced to modernize and compete with Western powers, it needed symbols of Japanese uniqueness, proof that the nation possessed something the West lacked. The samurai, or rather a carefully sanitized version of them, fit perfectly into this narrative. Their martial traditions could be portrayed as evidence of Japanese spiritual superiority. Their loyalty could be held up as a contrast to Western individualism. Their willingness to die could be presented as proof of Japanese devotion to higher ideals. But this rehabilitation required massive historical revisionism. The betrayals had to be forgotten. The brutality had to be minimized. The parasitism had to be reframed as service. Most importantly, the absence of any genuine honor code had to be corrected through the retroactive creation of Bushido as we know it today. This is where Nitobe Inazo enters our story. A Christian convert educated in the West, Nitobe understood both Japanese history and Western expectations. His book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, wasn't a description of historical samurai behavior. It was a prescription for how samurai should have behaved. A fantasy of what they might have been if they had actually followed the principles they claimed to embrace. Nitobe's Bushido was a hybrid creation, blending Christian ethics with cherry-picked Japanese traditions, adding philosophical depth that had never existed in actual samurai culture. He created a code of honor that was more European than Japanese, more Christian than Buddhist, more idealistic than realistic. And he presented it as the ancient foundation of Japanese civilization. The tragedy is that Nitobe's invention worked too well. His Bushido became more real than the reality it replaced. The fantasy of honorable samurai became so compelling that it overwrote the historical record of brutal warlords. The myth became more powerful than the truth, more influential than the facts, more dangerous than the reality it concealed. This manufactured Bushido had consequences far beyond historical revisionism. It became a tool of political manipulation used to justify Japanese imperialism in the 20th century. The same fabricated code that had been created to make samurai seem honorable was twisted to make conquest seem noble. Aggression seemed defensive, and atrocities seemed justified. Japanese soldiers in World War II were told they were following the way of the warrior when they bayoneted prisoners. They were convinced they were honoring samurai tradition when they conducted medical experiments on civilians. They believed they were embodying Bushido when they forced entire populations into slavery. The manufactured mythology of samurai honor became the ideological foundation for some of history's worst war crimes. The connection isn't coincidental. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed historical samurai to commit atrocities while believing themselves honorable were deliberately cultivated in imperial Japanese forces. Soldiers were taught to view mercy as weakness, to consider their own lives worthless, to find meaning only in service to authority. They were systematically dehumanized and then convinced that this dehumanization was noble. The results were predictable. Japanese forces in World War II displayed the same combination of extreme violence and self-righteousness that had characterized their samurai predecessors. They committed massacres while believing they were bringing civilization. They conducted genocide while convinced they were serving justice. They enslaved millions while certain they were liberating them. This wasn't an accident or aberration. It was the logical conclusion of a value system that had been refined over centuries to produce exactly this kind of behavior. The samurai had created a culture that could transform any atrocity into virtue, any cruelty into honor, any oppression into service. When that culture was scaled up to industrial levels and applied to modern warfare, the results were catastrophic. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the Comfort Women's System, Unit 731's medical experiments, all of these horrors flowed directly from the same mindset that had allowed samurai to test their swords on living prisoners and call it honor. The perpetrators weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people who had been convinced that monstrous behavior was not just acceptable, but noble. This is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the true history of the samurai. Evil doesn't usually announce itself as evil. It dresses itself in the language of honor, duty, and tradition. It convinces its practitioners that their worst impulses are actually their highest virtues. It creates systems that reward cruelty while punishing compassion, that elevate violence while denigrating peace. The samurai weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people who had been shaped by a system that transformed human beings into weapons and called the transformation noble. Their story isn't just Japanese history. It's a warning about what happens when societies prioritize power over truth, when they choose comforting myths over uncomfortable realities, when they allow the powerful to rewrite history in their own image. Because here's the terrifying truth about the samurai legacy. It didn't end with the Meiji Restoration. It didn't die with the last rebellion. It lives on wherever people believe that violence can be noble, that cruelty can be honorable, that oppression can be justified by appealing to higher principles. The samurai code was never about honor. It was about control. It was about convincing people that their suffering was meaningful, their oppression was necessary, their deaths were gifts. It was about creating a population so thoroughly indoctrinated that they would police themselves, that they would thank their oppressors, that they would pass their trauma on to the next generation and call it tradition. And that system never truly died. It simply evolved, adapted, found new forms and new victims. Because the fundamental appeal of the samurai myth isn't really about Japan or warriors or ancient codes. It's about the seductive promise that violence can be transcendent, that cruelty can be sacred, that we can commit terrible acts and still consider ourselves good people as long as we follow the right rituals and mouth the right words. This is why the samurai story matters today, not because it tells us about medieval Japan, but because it reveals how easily human beings can be convinced to participate in their own oppression, how readily we'll accept suffering if it's packaged as honor, how quickly we'll abandon our humanity if we're told it makes us superior to others. Consider the psychology of the average samurai retainer. This was a man who had been told from childhood that his greatest virtue was his willingness to die on command. His entire identity was built around the idea that his life had value only insofar as he was prepared to throw it away. He lived in constant readiness for a death that might never come, that might be demanded for reasons he would never understand, that might serve purposes completely unrelated to anything he believed in. This wasn't just psychological torture. It was psychological surgery, the systematic removal of everything that makes a person human: self-preservation, autonomy, the ability to form genuine relationships, replaced with mechanical obedience to authority. And the most insidious part was that the victims were taught to be grateful for this mutilation. They were convinced that having their humanity stripped away was actually a gift, that becoming a weapon in human form was the highest possible achievement. The techniques used to accomplish this transformation are disturbingly sophisticated. Young samurai weren't just taught to fight. They were taught to suppress every natural human response that might interfere with violence. Empathy was trained out of them through exposure to suffering they were forbidden to alleviate. Curiosity was crushed through punishment for asking questions. Independent thought was eliminated through constant repetition of approved responses to every conceivable situation. By adulthood, these men weren't really making choices anymore. They were executing programming. When ordered to kill, they killed. When told to die, they died. When commanded to believe something, they believed it. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that conscious decision-making had become almost impossible. But here's what makes this even more horrifying. The system worked so well that its victims became its most enthusiastic promoters. Samurai who had been brutalized as children grew up to brutalize the next generation, convinced they were passing on something precious. They had been so completely broken that they couldn't recognize their brokenness. They mistook their programming for wisdom, their conditioning for honor, their trauma for tradition. This creates a feedback loop that can persist for centuries. Each generation of victims becomes the next generation of perpetrators, each convinced they're preserving something noble. The system becomes self-sustaining, requiring no external force to maintain itself because its victims have been transformed into its guardians. And this is exactly what happened with Bushido mythology. The descendants of samurai victims became the primary promoters of samurai virtue. They took the very system that had destroyed their ancestors' humanity and elevated it into a sacred tradition. They transformed historical trauma into cultural identity, making it impossible to criticize the system without seeming to attack their entire heritage. This psychological trap is still operating today. Millions of people around the world have internalized the samurai myth so completely that questioning it feels like questioning their own values. They've been convinced that admiring samurai honor makes them more noble, that respecting warrior traditions makes them more principled, that embracing the way of the sword makes them more authentic. But what they're actually embracing is a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy designed to make brutality seem beautiful, oppression seem honorable, and trauma seem sacred. They're not connecting with genuine Japanese culture. They're connecting with a manufactured mythology created to hide the reality of historical suffering. The real Japanese culture that survived the samurai period wasn't built on warrior values. It was built by farmers who fed the nation, artisans who created beauty, merchants who built prosperity, and scholars who preserved knowledge. These were the people who actually made Japan great, who actually embodied the virtues that samurai claimed to represent. But their stories don't sell movies or inspire martial arts schools. So they've been forgotten in favor of the warrior myth. This selective memory reveals something crucial about how power shapes narrative. The samurai managed to write themselves into history as heroes not because they were heroic, but because they were the ones holding the pens. They controlled the records, commissioned the art, funded the poetry that would define how future generations remembered them. They literally purchased their own immortality, buying a version of history that served their interests rather than reflecting their reality. And this manufactured history has had real consequences. The samurai myth didn't just distort our understanding of the past. It actively shaped the present, influencing everything from Japanese politics to global popular culture. The same values that once justified feudal oppression were recycled to justify imperial expansion, then corporate authoritarianism, then nationalist extremism. Each time, the core appeal was the same, the promise that surrendering your humanity would make you superhuman, that accepting oppression would make you noble, that embracing violence would make you virtuous. The specific context changed, but the fundamental lie remained constant. This is why understanding the true history of the samurai is so important. Not because we need to condemn modern Japan, which has largely moved beyond these toxic values, but because we need to recognize the patterns that allowed such a system to persist for so long. We need to understand how ordinary people can be convinced to participate in extraordinary evil, how victims can be transformed into perpetrators, how lies can become more powerful than truth. Because the samurai system wasn't unique to Japan. Variations of it have appeared throughout human history, wherever those in power needed to convince others to die for their benefit. The specific rituals change, the cultural context shifts, but the underlying psychology remains the same. The promise that meaningless death will create meaningful life. The lie that surrender equals victory. We see echoes of samurai psychology in every extremist movement, every cult of personality, every system that demands absolute loyalty while offering nothing in return. The techniques are the same: isolation from outside perspectives, punishment for questioning authority, rewards for conformity. The constant reinforcement that suffering is sacred, that resistance is futile, that the only path to honor runs through submission. The difference is that modern systems rarely have centuries to perfect their control mechanisms. They don't have the luxury of generational conditioning that allowed the samurai to create such thoroughly programmed human beings. But they try. Every authoritarian movement attempts to recreate some version of the samurai ideal, the perfectly obedient warrior who will commit any atrocity while believing it serves a higher purpose. This is what makes the samurai myth so dangerous. It's not just historical revisionism. It's a blueprint for creating human weapons, an instruction manual for transforming people into tools, and as long as we continue to romanticize this transformation, we remain vulnerable to anyone who wants to exploit it. The antidote to samurai psychology isn't complicated, but it is difficult. It requires us to value individual conscience over group loyalty, to prioritize human empathy over abstract principles, to choose uncomfortable truths over comforting lies, to recognize that genuine honor comes not from willingness to die, but from courage to live according to our deepest values, even when it's inconvenient. Real honor means refusing to participate in systems that dehumanize others, even when participation would benefit us. It means questioning authority, even when questioning is dangerous. It means choosing compassion, even when cruelty would be easier. It means accepting the complexity of human nature instead of pretending that simple codes can govern complex situations. These are not warrior virtues, they're human virtues. They don't require swords or ceremonies or elaborate rituals. They just require the courage to remain human in systems designed to turn us into something else. The courage to think when we're told to obey, to feel when we're told to harden, to connect when we're told to isolate. This is the real lesson of samurai history. Not that warriors are noble, but that nobility has nothing to do with warfare. Not that honor comes from following codes, but that true honor means having the strength to break codes that demand we sacrifice our humanity. Not that death gives life meaning, but that meaning comes from how we choose to live, not how we're willing to die. The samurai created a system that lasted for centuries by convincing people that their worst impulses were actually their highest virtues. They turned cruelty into ceremony, oppression into honor, trauma into tradition. They built an entire culture around the idea that human beings were most valuable when they were least human. But cultures can change. Systems can be dismantled. Lies can be exposed. The samurai myth has persisted for so long, not because it's true, but because it serves powerful interests, because it makes people easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to sacrifice for causes they'll never fully understand. The moment we stop believing that violence can be noble, that cruelty can be honorable, that our suffering serves some higher purpose, the samurai system loses its power. The moment we choose to value human life over abstract ideals, to prioritize compassion over obedience, to trust our own moral instincts over external authority, we break the chains that have bound countless generations to cycles of violence and oppression. This isn't just about understanding history. It's about freeing ourselves from history's grip. It's about recognizing that we don't have to repeat the patterns that previous generations accepted as inevitable. We can choose to build something better, something more humane, something that honors the best of human nature instead of exploiting the worst. The samurai are dead. Their system is dead. Their power is dead. But their myth lives on, and as long as it does, it will continue to seduce new generations into believing that their humanity is a weakness to be overcome rather than a strength to be cherished. The only way to finally defeat the samurai is to stop worshiping them, to see them for what they really were, and to choose a different path forward. Because in the end, that's what the samurai feared most. Not enemy armies, or foreign invasion, or technological change. They feared a world where people valued their own lives, where individuals thought for themselves, where human beings refused to be transformed into weapons. They feared a world where honor meant something more than obedience, where courage meant something more than willingness to die, where strength meant something more than capacity for violence. That world is still possible, but only if we have the courage to choose it. Only if we're willing to abandon the comforting lie that someone else's code can make us noble, that someone else's cause can give our lives meaning, that someone else's definition of honor can guide our choices. Only if we're brave enough to define these things for ourselves, according to our own deepest understanding of what makes life worth living. The brutal reality of the samurai code wasn't just what it did to its victims, it was what it did to its followers. It turned human beings into ghosts, shadows of what they might have been if they had been allowed to remain fully human. The greatest tragedy of samurai history isn't the people they killed, it's the people they prevented from truly living. But that tragedy doesn't have to be ours. We can choose differently. We can choose better. We can choose to be fully human in a world that constantly tries to make us something less. That choice, not any warrior code, is where real honor begins. The samurai's influence on Japanese society created a psychological wound that festered for generations. Children who grew up under their rule didn't just learn to fear authority, they learned to worship it. They internalized the belief that their own thoughts and feelings were not just worthless, but dangerous obstacles to proper behavior. This wasn't accidental. It was the deliberate cultivation of a population that would never question, never resist, never imagine that things could be different. Think about what this means in practical terms. Imagine being raised in a world where your natural impulse to help someone in pain is drained out of you because showing mercy might displease a samurai, where your curiosity about why things work the way they do is beaten down because asking questions suggests disloyalty, where your instinct to protect the weak is replaced with the understanding that the weak deserve their fate because they lack the strength to change it. This systematic destruction of human empathy created generations of people who were incapable of genuine moral reasoning. They could follow rules, recite principles, and perform rituals, but they couldn't make independent ethical judgments because that capacity had been surgically removed from their psychological development. They became moral robots, executing whatever program had been installed by their superiors. The samurai understood that this kind of conditioning had to begin early, before children developed the critical thinking skills that might allow them to resist. So they created educational systems designed not to teach, but to indoctrinate. Schools that focused not on knowledge, but on obedience. Curricula that emphasized not understanding, but memorization of approved responses. Students weren't encouraged to think about why certain behaviors were considered virtuous. They were simply drilled in performing those behaviors until they became automatic. They weren't taught to evaluate moral situations. They were given predetermined answers to predetermined questions. They weren't educated to become fully realized human beings. They were programmed to become components in a social machine. This educational approach produced exactly the kind of citizens the samurai needed. People who would follow orders without question, who would accept suffering without complaint, who would pass on the system's values without examining them. People who had been so thoroughly conditioned that rebellion literally never occurred to them as a possibility. But the conditioning went deeper than just education. It permeated every aspect of daily life. The way people walked, talked, ate, slept, all of it was regulated according to samurai preferences. There was no private sphere where individuals could develop their own identity. Every moment of every day was subject to potential samurai judgment, and that judgment could be fatal. This constant surveillance created what psychologists now recognize as learned helplessness. When every aspect of your existence is controlled by forces you can't influence, when resistance leads to punishment, not just for you, but for everyone you care about, when submission is the only behavior that offers any hope of survival, you eventually stop trying to control anything. You become passive, accepting whatever happens to you as inevitable. The samurai leveraged this psychological state to maintain their control with minimal effort. They didn't need massive armies or complex bureaucracies to enforce their will. They just needed the knowledge that they could destroy anyone, anytime, for any reason. The threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself because it operated constantly in everyone's mind, shaping behavior even when no samurai was present. This is why samurai rule was so stable for so long. They didn't just control people's bodies, they controlled their imaginations. They made it impossible for most people to even conceive of alternatives to the existing system. Resistance required not just courage, but the ability to imagine that resistance was possible. And that capacity had been systematically eliminated from most people's psychological repertoire. The few individuals who did manage to resist were dealt with swiftly and publicly, their punishments designed not just to eliminate them, but to reinforce everyone else's conditioning. Public executions weren't just about removing threats. They were about reminding the population that thinking differently led to death, that questioning authority led to suffering, that the only safe path was complete submission. Over time, this created a society where the threat of punishment became unnecessary because the population had internalized the samurai value system so completely. People began to police themselves more effectively than any external force could. They monitored their own thoughts for signs of disloyalty. They suppressed their own impulses toward compassion or independence. They became their own oppressors. This internalized oppression was perhaps the samurai's greatest achievement. They created a system that could maintain itself without their constant intervention. The victims became the enforcers, passing on their trauma disguised as wisdom, perpetuating their oppression disguised as tradition. Each generation became more thoroughly conditioned than the last, until the original brutality of the system was forgotten and only the mythology remained. But mythology, as we've seen, can be more powerful than reality. It can shape behavior for centuries after the conditions that created it have disappeared. It can influence people who never lived under the original system, who have no direct experience of its brutality, but who have internalized its values through cultural transmission. So here we stand today, centuries removed from the last samurai rebellion, yet still haunted by the ghosts they created. The brutal reality of the samurai code wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a blueprint for human control that continues to echo through our modern world. Every time someone tells you that your suffering serves a higher purpose, every time authority demands blind obedience, every time violence is dressed up as honor, you're witnessing the samurai system in action. The only way to truly defeat this legacy is to recognize it for what it always was, a lie wrapped in ceremony, designed to convince human beings that their humanity was something to be sacrificed rather than celebrated. Thanks for joining me on this journey into history's darkest corners. Until next time, keep questioning everything